Woodstock rifles don't win matches anymore, old man. The remark echoed across the firing line, carrying beyond the benches and stretching all the way toward the canyon wall where the distant targets stood waiting. Tanner Boggs made sure everyone nearby heard it. At 29 years old, with consecutive podium finishes in the regional PRS circuit and a growing reputation as co-owner of Sierra Alta Range, he had grown used to people paying attention whenever he spoke. Walter Marsh never turned to acknowledge him. 75 years old, he remained seated quietly at the far bench with a weathered canvas wallet of handwritten index cards resting across his lap. His breathing was slow and shallow while he sat still, the easy rhythm of an aging man conserving every movement. Yet the instant his hand settled onto the rifle case beside him, everything changed. His breathing settled into a measured 4-count rhythm so steady that anyone watching from a distance might have mistaken him for someone asleep rather than preparing to shoot. Inside the case rested an old pre-64 Winchester Model 70 featherweight. Decades earlier it had been rebarreled to .3006 by an Albuquerque gunsmith whose shop had disappeared long before Tanner ever entered the sport. Beside the rifle lay a worn logbook filled with 46 uninterrupted years of handwritten notes recorded carefully in pencil. A few benches away, Tanner's own rifle rested beneath a protective sleeve. It was a modern custom-built 6.5 PRC with a carbon barrel and premium optics worth more than Walter's aging pickup truck. Walter calmly lifted a single cartridge from its box and lightly tapped the primer against the edge of the shooting bench. He wasn't listening for noise. He was listening for consistency. The tone told him whether the case had been prepared exactly the same way it had been thousands of times before. Satisfied, he placed it gently into the loading tray without saying a word. Nobody standing there had any idea what repeating the same careful process for 46 years could produce. By the end of the morning, every person on that firing line would understand. If you believe real consistency is earned through countless small actions instead of expensive equipment, type "earned" in the comments. Every veteran, hunter, marksman, or hard-working craftsman has a place here. Sierra Alta rested in a quiet basin of high desert roughly 40 minutes east of Deming. Juniper trees climbed the hills behind the range while steep canyon walls enclosed the far end almost like nature had designed the perfect shooting arena. Under the awning, 6 chronograph screens blinked patiently beside folding tables. Steel targets stood at carefully measured distances reaching all the way to the 1,000-yard berm. Whenever the wind settled, shooters could hear the steel ring almost 2 seconds after each trigger press. This was Tanner's range. He had built its reputation through years of competition, instructional videos, and successful finishes. Most of the students attending that day's clinic had discovered him through social media clips or tournament photos. They looked at him the way hopeful students always look at someone they believe has already mastered the craft. Dean Whitlock was 61 and had spent nearly 3 decades pouring concrete before retirement. After saving for 2 years, he had finally purchased the rifle he hoped would carry him into his first PRS competition. Marcy Odell, only 23, had never spent serious time behind a precision rifle before. She still shifted her hands uncertainly along the stock, trying to discover where everything felt natural. 15-year-old Colby Ashby wandered between benches with his phone raised, recording clips while unofficially keeping score for his grandfather Gordon, the range officer who supervised nearly every Saturday clinic. 10 minutes before anyone heard the insult, Tanner had crouched beside Dean's rifle to inspect it. His fingers slid along the scope mount before stopping immediately. "Your rear ring isn't tightened correctly," he said. "Maybe 16 pounds. Could even be less." Without waiting for permission, he reached into his tool kit, grabbed a torque driver, adjusted the mounting screws to the proper specification, then handed the rifle back. He asked for nothing in return. No lecture. No charge. Just a quiet correction before moving on. Dean thanked him twice before Tanner had already walked toward another bench. That side of Tanner rarely made it into online discussions. Walter had arrived exactly at 7 that morning. He quietly paid his range fee in cash, nodded politely to the employee at the counter, and walked directly to the farthest shooting bench. A faded Camp Perry pin rested on the brim of his old ball cap, something so ordinary that almost nobody noticed it. He unpacked his shooting rest. His spotting scope. His rifle. His weathered stack of handwritten data cards. Then he sat silently. He introduced himself to no one. Colby noticed the rifle first. "There isn't even a rail on that thing," he muttered. "No muzzle brake either. Is that even legal for PRS?" Nobody answered. Moments later Tanner looked over. His eyes moved from the old Winchester to Walter's stack of handwritten index cards, and something about the scene convinced him it deserved an audience. He raised his voice just enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Sir, 1975 called. It wants its load data back." Marcy laughed because Dean laughed. Colby didn't. Instead, he quietly lifted his phone and kept recording. Walter never reacted. He simply seeded another primer with one smooth press, the movement so calm and controlled that it resembled watching the needle on a precision scale slowly settle exactly at 0. Nothing hurried him. Nothing distracted him. Every movement simply ended when it reached perfection. Only after finishing did Walter briefly lift his eyes toward Tanner. He didn't answer. He simply reached for another cartridge and continued working. Nearly 20 minutes into the clinic, Walter finally spoke for the first time. Without lifting his eyes from the notes he was marking, he said quietly, "The wind's about to change." He continued writing. "Give it another 4 or 5 minutes." Nobody had asked his opinion. Tanner glanced toward the canyon, seeing only sunlight stretching across dry brush and distant rock. He dismissed the comment without saying anything. Dean quietly repeated Walter's prediction under his breath, smiling as though it might become the morning's next joke. Exactly 4 minutes later, the flag standing at the 200-yard marker rotated nearly 90 degrees as the wind shifted across the valley. Tanner never acknowledged it. Instead, while watching Walter continue assembling another cartridge, Tanner spoke loudly enough for the entire group to hear. "You ought to sit this one out," he said with a smile that tried to pass as concern. "That full power .3006 kicks a little harder than most people your age should probably deal with." The words were framed like friendly advice. This time, nobody laughed. The silence that followed carried far more weight than the first joke had. Even Tanner seemed to recognize that something felt different, yet he continued speaking as though nothing had changed. Turning back toward Dean, he began explaining how to read the mirage drifting over the 600-yard target. Walter listened without interrupting. He quietly glanced at his watch. It was 9:15. He planned to leave shortly after 1:30, and there wasn't much reason to stay beyond that. His hand almost slipped the canvas wallet back into his jacket pocket. Almost. The insult itself wasn't what kept him seated. It was what Tanner said next. As he continued teaching, Tanner confidently explained that the mirage across 600 yards would bend in one consistent direction from firing line to target. Walter knew immediately it wasn't true. Not even close. Mirage rarely behaved that way across changing terrain. Teaching someone to believe otherwise would leave shots drifting low and wide whenever conditions became complicated. Dean had paid to learn something accurate. Instead, he was being taught something that merely sounded convincing. Walter remained silent. Dean, still smiling from Tanner's earlier kindness with the scope rings, nudged Colby with his elbow. "Maybe somebody should let the old-timer shoot a few rounds," he joked. "Would be interesting to see what that old .30-06 can still do." He hadn't meant anything by it. The comment floated across the benches until it reached Tanner. Tanner slowly turned. Something about his posture stiffened. His shoulders squared. His confidence shifted into something more personal. 5 rounds each, he said. His voice carried across the range. 1,000 yards. He looked directly at Walter. "Right now, if you're willing." No one pressured him into making the challenge. The words came entirely from Tanner himself. Gordon Ashby looked up from the timing stand the moment he heard them. According to Sierra Alta's rules, anything outside the scheduled clinic required approval from the range officer. Gordon studied Tanner carefully before turning toward Walter. Around them, every student had stopped what they were doing. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Without asking either man whether they were certain, Gordon walked to the sign-in sheet and quietly recorded the time. Marcy instinctively tightened her grip around her rifle case. She couldn't decide whether she felt excited or nervous. Colby already had his phone raised before Tanner had even finished speaking. Walter finally lifted his eyes. Not toward Tanner. Toward the shimmering air hanging over the canyon floor. His gaze followed the mirage as it twisted, flattened, and reformed itself. He read it the same way another man might study instruments on an aircraft panel. Then he calmly placed his final prepared cartridge into the loading tray. "All right," he answered. "Nothing more." Gordon personally took responsibility for reading the chronograph numbers. No one wanted a phone application settling what was about to happen. Tanner shot first. He settled behind the rifle with practiced confidence. Bipod planted. Rear bag positioned perfectly. 5 cartridges from a recently purchased lot of ammunition that had never been completely verified through the chronograph. His first shot landed well. The second stayed close. The third climbed slightly. The fourth climbed even higher. By the 5th shot, the tight cluster had stretched into a vertical line across the target paper 1,000 yards away. To an inexperienced shooter, it might have looked acceptable. To someone who had spent decades studying every tiny variable, it told an entirely different story. Gordon received the measurements from downrange. 11.18 inches. He glanced toward the chronograph screen. 41 feet per second extreme spread. Respectable. Certainly not embarrassing. But it wasn't the level of consistency expected from someone who had stood on regional podiums twice. Tanner quietly stepped away from the bench. He avoided looking at anyone. Walter stood without hurry. He ignored phones. Ignored wind applications. Ignored electronics entirely. Instead, he performed the same 3 checks he had repeated before every shooting string for nearly half a century. He confirmed primer seating by touch. He listened carefully as the bolt closed. He studied the flag position 200 yards away. Finally, he spent several long seconds watching the mirage drifting across the canyon, comparing what he saw with the observations already written on his handwritten data card. Only then did he settle behind the rifle. The same rear bag Tanner had used now supported the old Winchester. Walter eased the stock into his shoulder with the relaxed familiarity of someone sitting in a favorite chair that had belonged to him for decades. Then he became perfectly still. His breathing slowed naturally into the familiar 4-count rhythm. Only after complete stillness settled over him did his finger move toward the trigger. The first shot broke. He cycled the bolt smoothly. No wasted movement. No rush. Before firing again, he simply waited for the wind to finish doing exactly what he expected it to do. Second shot. Another calm reload. Third shot. The bolt slid effortlessly through the receiver, polished smooth by 46 years of identical repetition. Fourth. Then fifth. Walter gently opened the bolt, removed the rifle from his shoulder, and laid it quietly on the bench. Nothing about his expression suggested he had accomplished anything unusual. Gordon chose to walk to the target himself. No one questioned why. Everyone watched him disappear toward the berm. When he returned, his pace was noticeably slower. He held the target sheet in one hand while looking back and forth between the paper and the chronograph display. Finally, he spoke. 7.4 inches. No one reacted. Then Gordon checked the chronograph once more before continuing. He looked twice, almost unwilling to believe it himself. 6 feet per second, extreme spread. Silence. Factory match ammunition often measured somewhere between 15 and 25 feet per second. Walter's hand-loaded ammunition had produced 6. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. It wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind that settles over a place built around loud noises when every person present realizes they have just witnessed something impossible to explain to anyone who wasn't standing there to see it happen. The chronograph screen still glowed beneath the awning. Fresh brass remained warm inside the loading trays. Yet the only thing anyone seemed capable of hearing was the truth that had just unfolded before them. Marcy slowly lowered her rifle until it rested against her hip. She pulled one side of her hearing protection away from her ear, almost as if she needed to hear those numbers directly instead of through layers of foam. Dean carefully lifted his eye away from the spotting scope and set it on the bench without even folding its legs. His attention wasn't on his equipment anymore. It was fixed entirely on Walter. Colby's thumb froze halfway through typing something on his phone. The unfinished sentence remained glowing on the screen while he simply stared toward the old shooter. Tanner never moved. His hands stayed exactly where they were. His jaw remained locked. He stood beside his own bench looking at a target positioned 1,000 yards away, unable to pull his eyes away from it. For the first time all morning, he had absolutely nothing to say. Gordon studied the target one more time before looking toward Walter. His voice remained flat, almost emotionless, as though he were announcing a fact rather than offering praise. There was a distinguished rifleman badge listed on his paperwork for over 20 years, Gordon said quietly. Until today. I never fully appreciated what that really meant. No one responded. Nobody needed to. The numbers had already spoken louder than anyone standing on the firing line ever could. The expensive rifle. The premium optics. The newest equipment. All of it had just been outperformed by decades of disciplined repetition. Not because modern technology failed. But because experience had quietly mastered every detail technology could never replace. The clinic resumed eventually, but nobody's attention was really on the lesson anymore. Conversations became softer. Movements became slower. Every student present found themselves glancing toward Walter from time to time, watching him pack away brass with the same deliberate care he had used while loading it. There was no celebration. No smile of victory. No satisfaction that needed to be displayed. He behaved exactly the same after shooting as he had before the challenge had ever begun. That, more than anything, unsettled Tanner. He had expected pride. Maybe even a little triumph. Instead, Walter acted as though the entire event had simply been another ordinary morning. Several minutes passed before Tanner finally began walking across the gravel toward him. For the first time that day, his baseball cap was gone. His hands were empty. His pace carried none of the confidence everyone had grown accustomed to seeing. He wasn't rehearsing clever words. He wasn't preparing another joke. In truth, he looked like someone who still hadn't figured out exactly what he needed to say. He simply knew he had to say something. When he reached Walter's bench, both men stood quietly for a moment. Finally Tanner broke the silence. I looked at your rifle. He paused. And all I saw was an old gun. His eyes drifted toward the weathered Winchester resting on the bench. I never saw 46 years of someone getting the same result on purpose. He exhaled slowly. I've spent my whole career believing newer automatically meant better. His voice grew quieter. Maybe that's because new equipment was all I ever had to prove myself. Walter looked at him for several seconds before answering. There was no anger in his face. No satisfaction. Only calm. There's nothing wrong with new, he said. The problem starts when you're certain you're right before you've taken the time to check. The words weren't spoken like criticism. They sounded more like a lesson that had been learned long ago. Walter reached down, picked up the worn canvas wallet holding decades of handwritten notes, and tucked it beneath his arm. He didn't continue explaining. He didn't need to. Everything important had already been said. Dean quietly walked over and offered Tanner his hand. Tanner accepted it without hesitation. No one mentioned the challenge. No one joked about scores. The atmosphere had changed completely. Marcy stepped closer, speaking almost in a whisper. "That breathing?" she asked carefully. "The 4-count rhythm before every shot." She hesitated. "Is that something people are simply born knowing?" Walter smiled gently. "No." He shook his head. "That was learned." He looked toward the range stretching into the canyon. "Just like every skill that's truly worth having." Marcy nodded without another question. Colby had stopped recording long ago. His phone now rested at his side while he simply watched. He looked like someone witnessing a lesson much bigger than shooting. A lesson he couldn't quite put into words yet. Tanner glanced toward the thick logbook lying beside Walter's rifle. "Would you mind if I looked at it?" Walter considered the request before opening the book. Not to the newest entries. To the very first page. The paper had yellowed with age. There were no load recipes written there. No detailed explanations. Only neat columns of numbers. Some entries had no labels at all. One corner of the page had torn away years earlier, leaving only part of the number 71 still visible. Several lines had been crossed out and carefully rewritten. The handwriting from those earliest pages looked noticeably less steady than the writing found near the end of the book. Tanner studied it quietly. "What am I looking at?" Walter answered without taking the notebook back immediately. "Those are numbers I always verify twice now." He smiled slightly. "I didn't always." The answer carried more meaning than the words themselves. It wasn't just about measurements. It was about discipline. About learning from mistakes instead of pretending they never happened. Walter gently closed the logbook before Tanner could ask another question. "If you really want to learn," he said, "come by my house someday." He shrugged casually. "Tuesday works. Any Tuesday. Don't bring anything except your rifle." The invitation surprised Tanner. After everything that had happened, Walter owed him nothing. Yet he offered his time anyway. Then Walter asked something unexpected. "You spent 6 years in the reserve, didn't you?" Tanner nodded. Walter looked directly at him. "Tell me how it really went." Not the version people put on resumes. For the first time since they had met that morning, Tanner spoke while someone else simply listened. He talked honestly. About frustration. About expectations. About mistakes. About things that had gone well and things that hadn't. Walter never interrupted. He simply listened. Neither man mentioned the challenge again. Neither mentioned the target. Neither mentioned who had won. Because by then, both understood the morning had never really been about winning. It had been about something much deeper. A rifle doesn't care how much money someone spent buying it. It doesn't care whose name appears on sponsorship banners. It doesn't care how modern the equipment looks. The rifle only responds to consistency. To discipline. To repeating the same correct process thousands upon thousands of times until excellence becomes ordinary. That lesson reaches far beyond shooting. It belongs to every trade. Every craft. Every profession where years of quiet dedication eventually outweigh talent, confidence, or expensive tools. The people who truly master something rarely need to announce it. Their work speaks long before they do. As the afternoon sun drifted lower across the desert, Walter opened the logbook one final time. He sharpened his pencil with 2 careful turns of a pocket knife. Then he added only 2 short lines. Today's date. Today's numbers. Nothing more. He closed the cover, slid the notebook beside the old Winchester, packed everything into the rifle case with the same deliberate care he had shown since sunrise, climbed into his truck, and headed south. He pulled away from Sierra Alta with plenty of time to make his 2 o'clock appointment, leaving behind a firing line full of people who would remember that morning for the rest of their lives, not because they had watched an old rifle outperform a new one, but because they had witnessed what 46 years of patience, humility, and relentless consistency truly looked like.